Hey guys, um, another look at some things in John. I want to pose some questions while I'm thinking about all this stuff. Trinity Delusion has been making quite a few videos about this, and instead of sending emails to people that would be much too long, I'll just kind of put it into a video format and go over how I'm looking at all of this, go over my questions, and go over what I think are some blatant problems with that understanding. And like I said, first and foremost, uh, the people that believe in this doctrine, or theology, whatever you want to call it, of the ministry being the direct point of emphasis in John. I have no problem with these people. I'm not trying to start any kind of debate or anything. I'm trying to fully understand what they're saying. And for me personally, it's just all about what's true. And for me to adopt something as true, I really need to understand it and have dealt with what I think are the harder parts of it and be able to explain it myself. Um, as it is right now, I couldn't explain John that way. Uh, and well, in a sense, I will say a lot of the stuff that they're saying about the word being, the conception of God coming to fruition and stuff. I think that's kind of a it's kind of like the consequence of what 1 John says. I don't think that's what's directly targeted. If that makes any sense. I think that's I would put it this way. I wouldn't say I would interpret John 1 that way, but I would say it would imply a lot of that understanding what people are saying, that believe in that. I think a lot of that would be implied, but I don't think it's what he was saying. Um, well, that wasn't what I think he was targeting, I guess is what I would say, because we do have very, very different understandings of John 1. Excuse me, still getting over the sinus infection. So with that, I'm going to kind of just put all this stuff together, how I'm looking at it, my questions, what I think the problems are, and just leave it there and see what happens. Okay, so the if you go from verse 1 to verse 5, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It was in the beginning with God. All things were made through it, and without it was not anything made that was made. And it was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, from what I understand, basically what they're saying is this word, the logos, is they're treating it more as the conception part coming to fruition. Is just, I guess, the simplest way for me to put it. It's something that comes out of a person, and um, it embodies the idea that they're thinking, I guess is what I would say. Um, and I wouldn't disagree with that. I wouldn't disagree that um, God would have to think it before he did it. Okay, that's what it's. I would say I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think I would disagree with it in John 1. So to me, the word in John 1 through verse 5 is it's the expression. It's the actual expression. I don't think John is dealing with so much the conception, even though translating it or interpreting it that way, I think, yes, it would imply, obviously, that God had to think it. My problem with it is this. There are basically three ways John would be using the word. And I think you have to pick one of the three. I don't think that you can use a duality, because I don't think John goes into that. And when I see the word, yes, I do compare it to the word in Genesis. Now, if you read Genesis 1, I think it's even clearer that Genesis 1 is about the command. It's about the actual word. It doesn't really sit there and talk about, God's conception of creation. It's just talking about the execution. So The three understandings, one would be the understanding that the beginning of the gospel people have, and that is, like I said, that internal thought, the expression coming out. Two would be the Torah, and I would actually put more credence in that one personally, with John being a Jew. And three would be the Logos in the Platonic sense. And it's kind of like the same problem at John chapter 10 when they say, you make yourself God, and he answers them calling them gods. And if you take the first uses of the word God and you say it's Yahweh, and then take the second use and make it divine judges, it doesn't communicate anything. And that's how I feel. I think the most important thing to John was the one God. And, as a Jew, I think that would have been burned into his head. So I think if he's saying the conception, because remember, the Logos to Cerinthus was not the conceptions of God. It was an actual person. It was a separate entity. So I'm assuming that John is addressing that thing. He's saying, hey, you believe in a second entity. And, think of it this way to me. In the beginning was the second entity. And the second entity was with God, and the second entity was God. You see, it's like he's got to be addressing it, I guess, is my point. And if he takes this to me it's kind of mystery. If you take this Logos as another meaning, then he's not really addressing Gnosticism. He's using actually a totally different line of thought. He's saying in the beginning was the self-contained expression. That doesn't have anything to do with the actual second person of the Logos in Platonic thought, to me. Now, when you get to verse 3, all things were made through it. I think you have that same thing. I think the genitive is being used there. So it's like the agent. The Word of God is the actual creative thing, if I'm understanding that correctly. So in him, or in it, was life, okay, in the command of God that we see in Genesis, and we see that illustrated there. To me, it's not saying in the conception of God's mind. And yes, I do agree with, when God thinks of something, it's done. I perfectly agree with that, and I understand it. But I think what he's saying is in the command, in the Word of God, because when he says his word, his power goes out from him. So in that expression was life, and life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Okay, and I think, yeah, that's a Genesis reference. But here's the funny thing, I guess we're going to start to differ. Well, if we haven't differed already. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. Okay? In that command, in verse 4, it says, and it was life, and life was the light of men. And I think, yeah, he is making a word play there. And then it says in verse 9, and the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. I think that's God. Okay? And he was in the world, and the world was made through him. There's that word dia again. Yet the world did not know him. That agency, God, was the agent of creation, the one God, which we see in verse 1. And he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God. We see that alluded to in the Old Testament. Sons of the Most High. Israel was his son. There were people in the Old Testament that were sons and daughters of God, who were born not of blood, nor of will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And then he tells you, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. I think he's laying this out in chronological order. The creation. Then he puts that statement about John bearing witness about the light that was contained in the command of God, in the Word of God. and then the Word becomes flesh, and we have seen his glory to the Son, from Father full of grace. John bore witness about him, cried out, "This was whom I said, who comes after me that ranks before me." For the fullness we have received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, and grace came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only begotten, who is at the Father's side, has made him known, or in the bosom. So when you go down, and yes, Jesus is the light of the world. But if you go to John 8:30, John 9:5, 11:9, and 12:35, he tells you he's the light for a time. But then he tells the disciples he's never going to leave them. He's always going to be with them. But yet he tells them he's the light for a time. And I think one of the other differences we have is at the baptism, it was pointed out that Jesus received that expression of what God wanted him to be at the baptism. I don't see it that way. And I would say the first thing I see is if we go to Luke chapter 2, verse 41, I believe he already was receiving the word. Okay, I believe he was getting that already before his baptism. It says, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple. See that? 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And, it goes on. But I think he was already being taught by God, receiving that word. But I think if I go back to John 1, when it says the true light was entering the world, the true light. And we see this in Revelations, 20, 21, and it tells you God is the light and Jesus is the lamp. It's supposed to be the same author, and he tells you the light is God and the lamp is Jesus. And Jesus tells you, I'm the light for a time. I'm here for a time. Enjoy me while you have the light among you. That's because I believe the Father was in the world without measure. At his baptism, when he received the Spirit, to me, I've said this many times before, my own personal understanding is that the Spirit is the presence of the Father, and the Father dwelt in him without measure. So I think what he's talking about coming into the world, this true light, Jesus is the light because the true light dwells in him. And I don't think the word concept holds up there. I think God entered the world at the baptism. He was in his temple. And you see that kind of play on Luke 2. And like I said, you really, and I guess people who may not know the difference, but verse 3 and verse 10 with dia being in the genitive case, as I understand it, you have a serious problem, because you'd be saying that the conception was the actual agent of creation. That's my understanding of it. That's, to me, that is a humongous problem. You can't just kind of, like I said, I have the utmost respect for my fellow brothers, but I think people are just ignoring this problem. That genitive in verse 3 and that genitive in verse 10. And that word is auton. It's masculine, if I'm understanding this correctly. So you have to say he was in the world and the world was made through him. And I've heard it said by people before that whatever you say about the word, you can say about Jesus. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe you can say Jesus created the world. I don't believe you can say that. And the fact that it says he was in the world, and think about it, doesn't it sound chronological to you, with the exception of verse 6, 7, and 8? if you push those to the side for a second, you have the Genesis creation, the word, the spoken word creating everything as you find in Genesis 1. Then you have to me, the story of the Old Testament, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. See, was coming into the world. So he's giving you a weird sense. And then he says he was in the world, and the world was made through, or you could translate that as by him, because it's agency. So there is, I think everyone would agree, there is only one true light, just like there's one true God. Okay, Jesus is the light for time, as far as in the flesh, what John was talking about, and he will return in that role. But we see in Revelation, God is the light, Jesus is the lamp. And he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave them the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And then he says the word becomes flesh and dwelt among us. If you take this the other way, to me it's kind of muddled. That's just me personally. It's basically like he's saying this one thing at verse 1 through 5. Then he's saying the same thing at verse 9 through 13. And then he says the same thing again at verse 14 through 18. And I think, like I said, looking at it this way, creation, separating John from Jesus, telling you that the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. And like I said, I just don't know how to stress it enough. Verse 3 and verse 10 to me are very problematic, because what you're saying is God's conception was the actual creator of things. And maybe, I know some people, it can be tricky, but people are just unaware of it in that understanding. And I know some people are, trust me. And, but to me, you just can't leave that open. You just can't say this and then get to verse 10 and say, well, it could mean a couple of things. No, the masculine aton, it means he. He was, it's talking about a he. And think about it. If John is in fact dealing with Gnosticism, and the word, the logos that they believed in, is collapsed into the one God. And you could also say the word was God-like, but then you have a problem either way. But if he collapses that, and then he tells you, to me, it gives you this hint. It says, in it was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Well, if he is making that relation to Genesis, God shone brightly, didn't he? He was the light that overcame the darkness. And he tells you he was already in the world, and that's my take on it. To me, he is actually addressing the claim of Gnosticism, because basically, if you say that the word was something other than the actual second person Cerinthus would have believed in, John's not really addressing Gnosticism. And I do think as a Jew, having a Torah understanding, that would be one of the first things that he addressed, was this understanding that there were two involved in creation. And I think, yes, there are some dualities, and I think a lot of stuff is inferred. When the word became flesh, don't overload my term and say, well, that's all I'm talking about, the word becoming flesh. No, what I'm saying is, I think people that think they're sacrificing the mechanical understanding of the text for a more theological understanding of the text. I think a lot of the stuff in the theological understanding of the text are implied by the mechanical understanding of the text. But I think when you flip those over, it muddies the waters for no reason. And I think it's clearly chronologically laid out. 1 through 5 is a group, 9 through 13 is a group, and 14 through 18 is a group. And all throughout the book of John, what does he tell you? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Well, when did the Father enter him? When did that happen? And it says he possessed the Spirit without measure. And I do believe that's the presence of God. So those are my kind of questions and problems, and I don't know. Like I said, I'm trying to see this from all angles. I'm definitely not, you know, uh, starting any problems or accusing anybody of anything. This is a tricky understanding. It's kind of like what basket are you going to put your eggs in, And as far as John chapter 6, if the Father is in that temple, that flesh, yeah, I think every word that comes out of his mouth is life. It's bread of life. It's, like I said, in a sense, it's kind of splitting hairs, but I think you can understand John 6 looking at it this way. Because, yeah, to me, I would say his flesh came from heaven. His flesh came from above. That's, to me, what the virgin birth is about, is that his flesh came from above. And then he was baptized. And the Father came to dwell in him without measure. So I could see him, he's the light for a time. That's what he says in the book of John. While I'm here, you're not in the darkness, you won't stumble. But then he tells them when I'm gone, I'm always going to be with you. But then he's telling people when I'm gone, you're basically going to be stumbling around. You're going to have issues because the light's not in the world anymore. And I don't know anywhere else in the Bible it says the Father came to dwell without measure in somebody. His temple, God's temple, and I think there is something to that. When the second temple was destroyed, there was no temple. To this day, there's no temple. If Jesus was that temple where God dwelled and he was taken away, then God there definitely has to be a presence sense. There has to be a lesser presence of God in the world in some form. There's no temple. And we know the text. This is the temple I made. He made a body. So that's my take on it. I would, I look forward to seeing how people respond to it and what their ideas might be. But I have not heard anyone that believes in this. Looking at verse 3 and verse 10, no one deals with that dia genitive. And to me, that's a huge problem. It just pops a hole in the whole thing. And, I'm trying to stay in John as much as possible. So I'm not going to jump to a bunch of other texts that I believe point this direction. I'm just going to simply say John 1, Genesis 1, John 9, John 1:9 through the Old Testament. And Jesus says it himself in the book of John. If the word are you called gods, and it's the rest of the term is sons of the Most High. So whoever got the word was called a son of God. And that was done by what? To me, it's the Spirit. If Isaiah's prophesizing, he's prophesying in the Spirit. And Isaiah, I would have viewed as a son of God. Noah, these people were doing the will of God. And then the word becomes flesh. So I believe it's laid out in that order. And there's a lot you can imply. But if you don't think John 1:10 and 1:3 are a problem, then I would suggest you look into it further. It's a massive problem, I think, for this belief. And I don't think that saying, well, it's neither here nor there, or we'll leave it open, to me that's not satisfactory in a sense, because it's really something that punches a hole in that understanding, like completely. And to minimize it, somebody is going to have to deal with that for me to make me understand that, because it's agency. I mean, it is the actual cause as I understand it. And if you're going to say the plan of God was the actual creator, it contradicts Genesis 1 and my understanding. And you get the same thing at 3. So, it just seems that people treat that subject, and it's kind of minutia. They're like, but it's huge. And yes, it does have to say he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. you know, and he came to his own. And it's, yeah, I could definitely see where that's harder. You could see where you could say that's Jesus, but I think that's God. I think that's history. And then he tells you the word became flesh in the true light, you know. That's the way I see it. So I'm gonna stop now. Like I said, that's my problem with the whole thing. Is one, that's a different Logos than the actual Logos that Cerinthus would have believed in. Two, the genitives in 3 and 10. 3, the true light. This, 9 through 13. It sounds just like the Old Testament to me. It sounds just like it. 4, verse 14, the word becomes flesh at that point. Yes, and it implies all that fulfilling of the conception. 5, I think the baptism was not, Jesus receiving the word. I think in Luke 2 we can see evidence that he was already receiving the word from God. So now we'd have to say, well, he received all of it. I don't know. I don't know how we would know that. And 5, well, 6, whatever I'm on, I think it is baptism. That's when God entered the world. That's my take on it, personally. I think God entered the world. And yes, by implication, you can say God showed him this and God showed him that. And the text just doesn't say that to me. And I think you can understand John 6 perfectly fine looking at it this way. That would be why it's actively coming out of Jesus, is because the Father is in him without measure. So, what he's speaking is emanating out of his body from the Father. He's speaking what he was told to speak. He's doing the things he was shown to do. And I just don't know how we would quantify and measure how much of the word he received at any given time. And it's, it's like I said, I think it interrupts the mechanical understanding. Personally, I think it's chronological, and I think you have to deal with the Gnostic mindset. And if you turn John 1 into something else, in the beginning was the conception. Well, that's not what Gnostics even believed. So it would strike me as odd. And I also think that other understanding completely jettisons the Torah understanding. I think John would have believed that the Torah was there in the beginning. So those are my problems with it. Maybe, and trust me, I'm not done thinking about this or learning. It's just that's where I'm at now, because to me it seems to make so much more sense. And I can actually use 3 and 10, because, that Martin Riggs actually brought up a good quote. You look in Matthew, when Peter makes the declaration of the Christ, and Jesus says, my Father's revealed this to you. I think in the Old Testament you had that same thing going on. The Father was revealing things to them. They were receiving the word, and they were called sons of God, Israel, son of God. So I think that's more of an Old Testament skewed text. And I think it's just chronological. Creation, Old Testament, New Testament, word becomes flesh. That's what it seems like to me. Baptism, God enters the world. So that's it. Thank you for your time. And like I said, I definitely, say all this in the gentlest spirit, that I can think of. I'm not here to prove I'm right or anything. I'm just having some real, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. I don't want to miss anything. I want to make sure that I'm understanding the argument as well as I can. And, it's still something that probably go on for months in my head now, because certain aspects of it to me, make a lot of sense. Other aspects of it to me make no sense. I think they're a stretch. And I think that we're going, to me, it's going beyond what the text says. We're drawing together a lot of assumptions and just saying, bam, there it is. So, I don't know. But I look forward to responses about these things. God bless.